Welcome back to A Good Length. I'm Dr. Venu Bhamidi, and today we're going to be talking about the cost of speaking up or speaking out. I want to start today's episode with a question. Think of a man in your life who you know is going through something hard, such as a separation, a false allegation, loneliness or depression, a custody battle, or the quiet devastation of losing daily contact with his children. Now ask yourself honestly, does he talk about it? And the answer is most likely no. And if you were to ask that man why, in a way where he felt safe enough to tell the truth, I suspect the answer won't be that I have nothing to say, but something more along the lines of, I don't know whether it's safe to say it. And that distinction between having nothing to say and believing something isn't safe to say is what this entire episode is about. Because I think it's one of the most important and overlooked issues facing men today. Last night I was speaking with a colleague and a friend after a meeting about this podcast. He's an incredibly intelligent medical specialist, extremely articulate, thoughtful, and very considered. He's a man that almost everyone admires and respects within minutes of meeting him. Over the last 5 years, he's gone through a painful, difficult divorce himself, and is now essentially estranged from his 16-year-old son for the last 18 months, while living in the same city. After the meeting, our conversation continued out into the car park, where we stood beside our cars exchanging stories, reflections, and our ideas. I told him about this podcast and how the idea for it was born during some of the most dark moments of my own struggles with separation and family court and the pain of losing the daily life with my children. And I told him something that sits at the very core of this entire project, that in many ways this podcast is ultimately for my two sons, a record of my thoughts, conversations that I want to have with them, and lessons that I want to teach them. Something they may one day listen to and better understand who their father was and what he believed and how deeply he loved them. And as we spoke and my friend shared his insights and thoughtful analysis, I found myself thinking how powerful his voice would be in these conversations. His story, perspective, and the way he saw the world. His journey through grief to repair, and his calm, measured, and eloquent way of speaking about difficult things. I was convinced that other men hearing him would immediately relate and instantly feel less alone. So I asked whether he would consider coming onto the podcast to share his experience publicly. He paused, congratulated me on my bravery for doing this, but politely declined. Not because he lacked insight or courage, and certainly not because he lacked something meaningful to say. He declined because he was cognizant of the risks and repercussions of speaking his inner thoughts freely and publicly, the potential consequences to his relationship, his family dynamics, his professional reputation, his social world. And perhaps most painfully, the fragile hope of one day reconnecting with his child. I reflected on that conversation on the drive home for the rest of the evening and throughout the day today. And honestly, I couldn't help but feel deflated. Because I realized something profoundly important. Many of the men whose voices most desperately need to be heard are precisely the men that are least likely to speak publicly. Not because they're weak, but because they've learned through experience that honesty can come with enormous personal cost. And that's the tragedy in all of this. We are surrounded by intelligent, emotionally aware, good men carrying extraordinary grief silently through their lives. Men who continue going to work, continue to operate successful businesses, continue treating patients with empathy and diligence, continue paying mortgages, and then, after all that, continue to smile socially and pretend they're okay. All while privately carrying heartbreak that most people around them never fully see. And yet many men remain terrified that speaking honestly about experiences may cost them even more than they already lost. That reality should concern all of us. Because silence is not always evidence that suffering doesn't exist. Sometimes silence is evidence that people no longer feel safe enough to tell the truth about what they're living through. Culturally, we've built an environment where many men no longer assess whether speaking up is right, they assess whether it's safe. And those are two very different things. What generally happens in healthy communication environments is that people primarily weigh the truth and the relevance of what they want to say. They ask themselves, is it true? Is it fair? Is it helpful? Can it be said constructively? Of course, the social dynamics still matter, and every human interaction carries risk. But fundamentally, the core calculation should remain centered around truth. But that can only happen when psychological safety exists. When people believe that they can speak honestly without disproportionate retaliation. But when psychological safety collapses, the entire calculation changes. The question transforms from, is it true and should I say this, to, what will happen to me if I say it? And for a growing number of men, particularly separated fathers, men navigating the family law system, men who have experienced emotional or psychological abuse or are trying to co-parent in hostile environments, the perceived consequences of speaking honestly can feel enormous. Because many fear being labelled misogynistic, bitter, controlling, angry, unsafe, woman hater, anti-feminist, complainer, and many more. And once those labels are attached to a man, fairly or unfairly, they can become extraordinarily difficult to escape. Many men genuinely believe that if they speak openly about issues such as family law, parental alienation, false allegations, financial pressures, loneliness, depression, that there is a real risk that their former partner may retaliate, that parental conflict may escalate, that it may restrict communication with the children and make co-parenting even harder than it already is. So they calculate and weigh it up, and they conclude that silence is a safer option. They stay silent because they choose peace, not because they have nothing to say, but because they believe the consequences of speaking up may be too high. And that silence comes at a cost, not just to men, but to society itself. Today, I sit here in front of you, acutely aware that I face the same reaction myself. Because making this podcast, sharing my story, and airing my opinions publicly carries consequences that feel very real to me. Consequences such as reputational destruction within my social circles or professional network and broader community. The fear of isolation and friends quietly siding with my ex-partner or family members distancing themselves. Colleagues becoming colder or even cautious around me. Significant professional reputational risk within my workplace, and perhaps most powerfully of all, increased conflict surrounding my children. We often say we want men to open up, but many men no longer feel convinced that the environment around them is safe enough to risk it. Because when people become afraid to speak honestly about topics such as pain and injustice, grief and fear, those problems do not just disappear. What we have learnt over time is that suppressed pain does not disappear, it transforms. And the form that it takes is rarely pretty. Sometimes it transforms into depression. And men who cannot talk about loss or grief often experience it as a slow, grinding, invisible depression. Not the stereotyped sadness we imagine, but something more like numbness. And sometimes that suppressed pain transforms into addiction, to alcohol, substances, or gambling. The compulsive search for anything that briefly quietens the internal noise that has nowhere else to go. Sometimes the pain transforms into rage, and not the clean, conscious anger of a man who knows what he's feeling and why, but the unpredictable and diffuse anger of a man whose emotional pressure valve has been sealed shut for far too long. And then we see the men filled with unexpressed resentment and anger start to slowly populate a rage-filled corner of society. Sometimes the pain transforms into emotional shutdown. Men who just stop feeling. Men who become opaque and distant and unreachable. Not because they don't care, but because they've learnt that caring and showing it is dangerous. And sometimes, and this is the part that I'll never stop saying out loud, it transforms into suicide. In Australia and the US, men die by suicide at approximately 3 to 4 times the rate of women. Across almost every Western nation, the gender disparity in suicide mortality is one of the most consistent and devastating public health patterns we have. In a 2025 meta-analysis of 75 studies, divorced men had 2.8 times the odds of suicide compared to married men. While the review also found that the immediate post-separation period was the riskiest. And separated men under the age of 34 had an 8-fold greater chance of suicide, with the risk highest in the first year after divorce. And yet, what I find extraordinary is that while we simultaneously tell men to open up, we culturally create conditions where opening up feels catastrophically unsafe. We ask for their vulnerability, and then too often we punish them for it and then act entirely surprised, dumbfounded at the devastating mental health outcomes that are disproportionately affecting men. We allow them to suffer and then become passive, sympathetic observers when the escalating crisis demands a solution. Here is the paradox that I think sits at the heart of this crisis. We constantly ask men to seek help and to talk to someone. We run campaigns, put up billboards, make social media posts. And while those messages are well-intentioned, here is what many of those campaigns miss. Telling men to be vulnerable without providing them with psychological safety is not help, it's exposure. And when men do speak, such as in my case, about painful relationship experiences or perceived injustices or the impact of parental alienation or grief at losing daily contact with their children, they are too often met not first with curiosity but with suspicion. Their experiences are questioned and their motives are interrogated. Their reputation is attacked. Their account of the story is filtered through a lens that automatically assumes that their pain is probably exaggerated or self-inflicted or a cover story for something worse. The research psychologist Brené Brown has spent decades studying vulnerability. And one of the most important things she identified is that vulnerability requires a foundation. It requires what she calls a container. The belief that what you share will be held with care and not weaponized. For many men, that container does not exist, not in court, not even always in therapeutic spaces or friendship groups, sometimes not even in their own family. And so we arrive at a terrible paradox. The very men we most need to hear from are often the least likely to speak. Not because they're weak or inarticulate or lack self-awareness, but because they have learned, usually through direct experience, that vulnerability without safety is not courage, it's massive risk, which comes with serious consequences. There's another important issue that needs attention, and that is the false binary that currently exists, and that which we absolutely need to reject. Every time someone speaks about male pain, there is almost a reflexive countermove in our cultural conversation. And it goes something like this. But what about women? Women suffer too. Women are abused. Women are abandoned. And women carry enormous burdens. And the answer to that is yes, absolutely, without qualification. There are many women who have suffered genuine abuse, coercion, violence, abandonment, trauma, and those realities matter profoundly and they deserve to be named and have resources, advocacy, and care directed towards them. They absolutely deserve the attention. But a mature society should be capable of holding two truths at the same time. That women can suffer profoundly and that men can too. And that advocating for fathers does not require attacking mothers. That discussing male pain is not misogyny. That questioning systems is not hatred. That listening to men should not require men to become perfect, unimpeachable victims before they are granted compassion. Because if every difficult male experience is immediately reframed as weakness, privilege, bitterness, or toxicity, if men cannot speak about injustice without being accused of undermining or hating women, men will continue retreating further into silence. And that silence has a literal suicide-related body count. Richard Reeves, in his book of Boys and Men, makes a compelling case that we have somehow allowed a zero-sum framing to dominate our understanding of gender, where acknowledging male struggles feels to some like a betrayal of progress for women. Because the men sitting in silence right now, the men quietly deteriorating, they are not the enemy of progress. They are human beings in pain, and they deserve to be seen. Let's talk for a moment about how staying silent necessitates payment. Not just for the individual men who carry it, but for all of us. When fathers disengage emotionally because they don't believe it's safe to speak, their children feel it. Children who grow up watching their fathers unable to articulate pain learn, by example, that pain is something you carry alone. Boys especially learn that this is what a man does. He endures, he does not speak. And the cycle perpetuates. When men don't seek therapy, their mental health deteriorates in private. Men seem largely averse to therapy because admitting to others or yourself that you are going to therapy still carries stigma. And many men have had the experience of entering therapeutic spaces that weren't equipped for male presentations of distress. And so men emerge from that deterioration state, not softer or connected, but harder and more defended and more isolated. And when men do report emotional, psychological, or physical abuse at the hands of their female partner, they come to find a system that is unlikely to believe them. And because the social humiliation of being a man who was abused is still, in many circles, profound, those experiences remain invisible. When separated men isolate after the breakdown of their families, including losing their home or their children or the social infrastructure that was once anchored to their relationship, and they find that they have no space to process that loss, the outcomes we see are catastrophic. Depression, substance abuse, homelessness, death. These important conversations desperately need to happen. We know from understanding the neuroscience of stress what happens when the human body chronically suppresses emotional states. The physiological cost is real. Elevated cortisol, disrupted sleep cycles, immune suppression, cardiovascular stress. The body doesn't distinguish between unspoken grief and physical danger. It responds to both as a threat. Bessel van der Kolk, in his book The Body Keeps Score, documented what suppressed trauma does to the nervous system over time. It doesn't resolve, it encodes. It shapes how a person sees the world, relates to others, parents their children. The unspoken thing does not disappear, it just moves deeper. So what can we actually do about this? The first is what I've already mentioned several times about psychological safety. And psychological safety for men begins with being believed before being interrogated. And this doesn't mean that male accounts should be exempt from scrutiny. In legal or clinical context, scrutiny is appropriate. But in the context of personal disclosure, such as in friendship, family, or therapy, meeting a man's pain with, "But what did you do?" before you've even offered acknowledgement is not critical thinking, it's a form of conditional compassion. And men learn from it quickly. We also need to stop pathologizing male anger while simultaneously denying men other emotional outlets. We tell men they're not allowed to be angry. We frame male anger as inherently dangerous, misogynistic, a problem to be managed. And then we offer them no alternate vocabulary, no space for grief, no room for injustice to be named. You cannot remove a pressure valve and then be surprised that the boiler eventually fails. We also absolutely and desperately need intergenerational conversations between men, which is where I'm hoping this podcast can add value to the body of work that already exists in this space. One of the core premises of this podcast is that there is wisdom in older men that younger men are not receiving because the structures that used to transmit it have largely collapsed. The family unit, the trade, the church, the community organizations, the extended male social network. Now, it's absolutely true that some of those structures were imperfect, and some of them carried toxicity. I won't romanticize them. But they also carried something important, the normalization of men navigating hard things together. Men watching each other endure difficulty and come through. We need to rebuild that. Not in its old form, but in whatever form works for this generation and time. And fourth, we all need to find our people. Not just a single confidant who you can burden with everything, but a small community of men around whom it's safe to be real. The necessity of male friendship that goes beyond the superficial, that isn't just sport and work and deflection. Male friendships where the real conversations are possible. And those relationships don't happen by accident. They require intention. They require vulnerability. They require the willingness to be the first one to go deeper. And yes, that is a risk. But the alternative is just more of the silence that we've been discussing. And we've already seen where that leads. So if we go back to the question at the start of this episode about that man we know that is going through something hard and not talking about it, I'm almost certain that he is silent because he has done the calculation, has weighed the risk, and has come to the conclusion based on information from his experience that speaking is more dangerous than silence. And our job as a society is to prove that calculation wrong. We're not going to achieve this by forcing men to speak, but by creating the conditions where the cost of speaking feels lower than the cost of staying silent. Not the absence of hard conversations, but rather the presence of enough trust to have them. This podcast is just one small attempt to be that space where we have those conversations that most men are too afraid to have, and certainly don't want to be seen having in public. A space where men's experiences are taken seriously and their pain is shared safely. Where the full range of what it means to be a man today, including the hard parts, the confusing parts, the parts that don't neatly fit into the political narrative, can be spoken about loudly without apology. So, if you found something useful in today's episode, I would ask you to do a few things. Engage with me, comment freely, and share widely with as many men in your network as you can. And please reach out to someone, anyone in your life, or even to me if you feel that way inclined, to start the conversation that you're too afraid to have. Be the one who goes first. And if you feel courageous enough, please come and sit with me and let's discuss it openly with others who may want to watch and listen. And if our only audience is our children, close friends and family, well, I can tell you now, that's more than enough. I'm Dr. Venu Bhamidi. Thank you for taking the time to get to the end of this episode. I appreciate it, and I'll catch you on the next episode.